The disappearance of Flight MH370 is one of the biggest mysteries in modern aviation history. Let's remind you of the story.
The Malaysia Airlines flight, carrying 239 people, including 4 Americans, disappeared into one of the greatest unsolved aviation mysteries of our time. Malaysia Flight MH370 vanished without warning, leaving the world in shock and disbelief. For years, investigators have searched the depths of the ocean, examined fragments of evidence, analyzed radar records, and reconstructed the aircraft's final movements, all in an attempt to understand how a modern Boeing 777 could simply disappear. But as the years passed, the mystery only seemed to grow. New findings, satellite data, unusual flight patterns, and competing theories began to paint a picture far more complicated than anyone had initially imagined. And before we go deeper into this extraordinary mystery, make sure you subscribe to the channel and help us reach our goal of 5,000 subscribers. Your support helps us continue bringing you stories like this, so take a moment to subscribe. And let's uncover the mystery of MH370 together. Today, we follow that trail from the final routine moments of the flight to the strange electronic signals that continued after MH370 disappeared, and eventually into the theories surrounding what may have happened during those final hours. On March 8, 2014, MH370 departed from Kuala Lumpur International Airport shortly after midnight, bound for Beijing. It was supposed to be an ordinary international passenger flight, covering roughly 5,570 kilometers in about 5.5 hours. On board were 227 passengers from 14 different countries, along with 12 Malaysian crew members. At the controls were Captain Zahari Ahmed Shah and First Officer Fariq Abdul Hamid, experienced pilots flying a Boeing 777-200ER, an aircraft widely regarded as one of the safest and most advanced long-haul passenger jets of its era. Nothing appeared unusual as the aircraft climbed into the darkness, and passengers settled into what should have been a routine overnight journey. At approximately 1:01 a.m., while cruising at around 35,000 feet, the aircraft transmitted a routine data report through the Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System. The information showed no obvious signs of trouble. Then, around 1:07 a.m., the aircraft sent what would become its final ACARS transmission, indicating that its systems were still operating normally. Another report was expected roughly 30 minutes later, but it never arrived. Then came the moment that would transform an ordinary flight into one of the most haunting mysteries in aviation history. At approximately 1:19 a.m., as MH370 approached the boundary of Vietnamese airspace, the cockpit communicated with Malaysian air traffic control. The final words were calm and seemingly ordinary. "Good night, Malaysia 370. It was the kind of phrase expected during a routine transfer between air traffic control centers. But this time, something was different. The Vietnamese controllers never received the expected communication from the aircraft. Moments later, MH370 disappeared from secondary radar. At first, the incident appeared to be a communication failure, perhaps a technical problem or some other temporary malfunction. But as controllers searched for the aircraft, it became increasingly clear that this was not a normal loss of contact. The plane had vanished, and no immediate explanation could account for where it had gone. What investigators did not yet know was that the aircraft had not simply disappeared at the moment it vanished from civilian radar. Evidence would soon emerge suggesting that MH370 had continued flying for hours after its final voice communication, transforming the case from a possible accident into something far more difficult to explain. The first major clue came not from wreckage or eyewitnesses, but from space. After MH370 disappeared from radar, an Inmarsat satellite continued to exchange brief electronic signals with the aircraft for several more hours. These were not ordinary conversations, and they did not contain a message explaining what had happened. Instead, they were faint electronic traces, almost like whispers from an aircraft that had supposedly vanished. In total, 7 satellite handshakes were recorded, with some initiated automatically by the aircraft and others prompted by the ground station. 2 satellite phone calls were also attempted, but there was no answer. Yet the fact that the aircraft continued to interact with the satellite was crucial. It suggested that MH370 had not suffered an immediate catastrophic breakup at the moment it disappeared from radar. Somehow, the aircraft appeared to have remained in the air, potentially at considerable speed and altitude, long after its communication systems had gone silent. Investigators now had a completely different problem. Instead of asking where the aircraft disappeared, they had to determine where it had gone after disappearing. Then came the radar evidence, and the mystery became even more unsettling. Military radar information, combined with air traffic control data, indicated that MH370 had not continued toward Beijing. Instead, the aircraft appeared to make a dramatic turn to the southwest before crossing back over the Malay Peninsula. It then passed near Penang Island, continued northwest across the Malacca Strait, and eventually disappeared from military radar coverage over the Andaman Sea. The aircraft had apparently traveled for more than an hour in a direction completely inconsistent with its original destination. For investigators, this raised questions that were difficult to answer. A Boeing 777 could not simply make such a journey by accident without some combination of systems, decisions, or circumstances causing it to deviate so dramatically. Families around the world were left desperate for answers, while investigators faced the extraordinary reality that a modern commercial aircraft equipped with sophisticated navigation and communication systems could vanish from the world's tracking network. The longer the investigation continued, the more difficult it became to believe that a single conventional explanation could account for everything. The satellite data eventually offered another crucial piece of the puzzle. Analysts began examining the Doppler shift associated with the aircraft's satellite communications. The principle was relatively straightforward. When an aircraft moves relative to a satellite, the frequency of the signal changes in a measurable way. By studying those changes, investigators could estimate aspects of the aircraft's movement and determine which possible flight paths were consistent with the recorded signals. The analysis suggested that MH370 had turned southward rather than continuing toward the north. At approximately 2:40 a.m., according to the reconstruction described in this theory, the aircraft appeared to have continued on a path leading away from its intended destination and toward the vast southern Indian Ocean. The satellite evidence could not provide a precise position like a conventional radar system, but it created an enormous arc of possible locations. Eventually, the final satellite data suggested that the aircraft had continued toward a remote region of the ocean before apparently descending near the end of the recorded sequence. Yet even this conclusion left investigators facing the same fundamental problem. There was still no confirmed wreckage marking the final resting place of the aircraft. The search for MH370 therefore became a search for the aircraft's black boxes, even though nobody knew exactly where those boxes were. The satellite evidence indicated that the plane may have remained airborne for several hours after disappearing from civilian radar, dramatically expanding the possible search area. Investigators from Malaysia, Australia, Europe, and the United States struggled with incomplete information and the enormous geographical scale of the Indian Ocean. early search efforts focused on areas that ultimately proved irrelevant, while valuable time passed without a confirmed location. The experience of Air France Flight 447 demonstrated just how difficult such a recovery could be. That aircraft had crashed into the Atlantic, and even though investigators had a relatively strong idea of where to search, locating its wreckage and flight recorders still required years of effort. MH370 presented an even greater challenge because investigators did not have a confirmed crash site. By April 2014, surface searches had largely concluded, and attention increasingly shifted toward the deep ocean. Australia eventually took a leading role in the underwater search, focusing on areas derived from the satellite analysis. Before specialized sonar equipment could be deployed, enormous portions of the seabed had to be mapped because the region was deep, remote, and largely unexplored. The search became a monumental engineering and logistical operation conducted thousands of meters beneath the surface of the Indian Ocean. As the search continued, another possibility began to dominate the discussion. What if MH370's extraordinary route was not the result of a simple accident? Investigators and independent researchers examined potential explanations ranging from technical failures and computer malfunctions to problems involving the flight controls, electrical systems, navigation equipment, fire, smoke, loss of cabin pressure, lightning, bird strikes, volcanic ash, and other rare hazards. Yet critics of these explanations argued that none could easily account for the aircraft's complex route, the apparent changes in communication systems, and the deliberate-looking navigation pattern. The more researchers reconstructed the flight, the more difficult it became to separate genuine evidence from speculation. Some theories suggested that the aircraft had been deliberately diverted, while others argued that a catastrophic emergency might have incapacitated the crew and left the aircraft flying under a combination of automated systems and remaining fuel. Still, no theory could explain every known detail with certainty, and the absence of definitive physical evidence allowed competing interpretations to survive. One of the more controversial theories came from independent researchers who examined radar data and proposed that the aircraft may have climbed to approximately 40,000 feet during part of its journey. Such an altitude would have placed enormous physiological stress on anyone inside the aircraft, particularly if cabin pressurization had been compromised. According to this theory, a deliberate depressurization could have caused passengers to lose consciousness unless they received adequate oxygen. The passenger oxygen masks, however, are designed primarily for emergency descent rather than sustained survival at extreme cruising altitude. The cockpit presented a different situation because the pilots had access to dedicated oxygen equipment capable of supporting them for much longer. In the theory's most disturbing version, someone could have remained conscious in the cockpit while the passengers became incapacitated. The aircraft could then have continued flying silently, becoming little more than a mysterious blip moving across military radar screens. That theory becomes even more unsettling when the aircraft's route toward Penang is considered. At one point, MH370 was reportedly moving toward an area near Butterworth Air Base, where Malaysian military aircraft and air defense radar were located. Yet no fighter interception followed that could explain why the aircraft continued on its course. For independent researchers, this raised another question. If military radar detected the aircraft, why was there apparently no immediate response? Was the aircraft not considered a threat? Was its identity misunderstood? Or were the available radar systems not being actively monitored in the way investigators later assumed? These questions remain part of the broader mystery, because the disappearance of MH370 was not simply about an aircraft vanishing over the ocean. It was also about a sequence of decisions, radar detections, communication failures, and unexplained movements that occurred while the aircraft was still potentially visible to sophisticated monitoring systems. The deeper investigators looked into those final hours, the more the story seemed to resist a simple explanation. And somewhere within those unanswered questions lies the reason MH370 remains one of aviation's most enduring mysteries. But the questions did not end with the aircraft's strange route, because investigators still had to determine how such a dramatic change in course could have happened in the first place. The evidence suggested that whatever happened inside MH370 occurred during a critical period when the aircraft was still communicating with the outside world. Between approximately 1:01 a.m., when the Boeing 777 reached an altitude of around 35,000 feet, and 1:21 a.m., when it disappeared from secondary radar, a series of events unfolded that would become central to the investigation. During that window, the aircraft's automatic condition reporting system transmitted information to the airline's maintenance department through a satellite connection. The transmission contained data about fuel levels, altitude, speed, geographic position, and possible system anomalies. And, importantly, it indicated that the aircraft's satellite communication system was functioning at that point. Yet shortly afterward, the aircraft vanished from secondary radar, and its movements began to suggest that someone, or something, had taken control of the situation. Military and civilian radar continued to provide fragments of information, and researchers later argued that the extremely precise turn toward the southwest was unlikely to have been produced by a simple automated malfunction. Some interpretations suggested that the autopilot may have been disengaged and that the aircraft's cabin had potentially been depressurized, while portions of the electrical system were switched off. None of these possibilities has been conclusively established, but taken together, they created an unsettling picture. The aircraft appeared to have been deliberately altered from its normal operating state, while the reason for those changes remained completely unknown. That uncertainty opened the door to an even more disturbing possibility: the idea that one of the pilots may have deliberately taken control of the aircraft. It was an uncomfortable theory, but investigators knew that history contained rare examples of pilots intentionally causing catastrophic crashes. In 1997, the captain of Silk Air Flight 185 was suspected of deliberately disabling important recorders before the Boeing 737 crashed into a river at high speed. Although the circumstances and official conclusions surrounding that crash remain disputed. In 1999, Egypt Air Flight 990 crashed into the Atlantic Ocean after investigators concluded that the aircraft's descent was deliberately initiated by the first officer, although Egyptian authorities disputed aspects of that conclusion. Then, shortly before the disappearance of MH370, another tragedy demonstrated just how devastating deliberate cockpit actions could be. In March 2015, Germanwings Flight 9525 was deliberately flown into the French Alps after co-pilot Andreas Lubitz locked the captain out of the cockpit. That case would later become one of the most haunting comparisons made during discussions about MH370. Yet the similarities could only go so far. The people who knew the MH370 pilots described them differently, and there was no definitive evidence establishing that either man intended to harm the passengers. The possibility remained a theory, not a proven explanation, and the absence of a clear motive made it even harder to accept. As investigators began examining Captain Zahari more closely, his personal life became another part of the mystery. Official accounts had generally portrayed him as an experienced and respected pilot, a family man who was comfortable with technology and particularly interested in flight simulation. His professional record did not immediately reveal the kind of warning signs that investigators might expect before such an extraordinary event. Assessments of his ability to handle workplace pressure were reportedly positive, and reviews of his behavior did not identify dramatic changes in his social interactions, routines, or interests. Airport security footage from the day of the flight and the 3 flights before it showed a man who appeared calm, well-groomed, and composed. Nothing about his posture, facial expressions, or movements immediately suggested that he was preparing to commit an act that would become one of the world's greatest aviation mysteries. Yet, as investigators examined his life in greater detail, reports emerged describing periods of personal isolation and difficulties within his relationships. These details were later interpreted by some commentators as possible signs of emotional distress, while others argued that such interpretations were speculative and unfair. The investigation also uncovered something that would become particularly controversial: data from Zahari's home flight simulator that reportedly contained a route with similarities to portions of MH370’s suspected path. For some researchers, this was a potentially significant clue. For others, it was simply evidence of a pilot experimenting with routes on a simulator, something that experienced aviation enthusiasts routinely do. The question was whether the simulator represented a genuine warning sign, or whether investigators were attempting to connect unrelated details after the disappearance had already occurred. The flight simulator evidence became even more intriguing when researchers began examining how the simulated journey had been constructed. Victor Iannello, a creative entrepreneur from Roanoke, Virginia, and a prominent member of an independent MH370 research group, became particularly interested in the way the simulated flight appeared to have been carried out. Rather than following one continuous journey, the simulation reportedly involved moving the aircraft forward in stages, manually adjusting fuel levels and making jumps between different points until the aircraft eventually disappeared from the simulation. To Iannello, this behavior was unusual enough to deserve serious attention. There had been no obvious technical requirement for Zahari to use a consumer-grade simulator in such a manner, and Iannello believed that simply dismissing the simulation as an irrelevant coincidence would be unwise. He proposed that the simulated route might have represented some kind of personal planning exercise, or even a symbolic trail of breadcrumbs left behind by the pilot. But this interpretation remained highly controversial. A simulator can contain countless experimental flights, and a resemblance between a simulated route and a later real-world event does not by itself establish intent. Still, the discovery became another piece of the enormous puzzle, because it offered researchers a rare glimpse into something the pilot had been doing privately before MH370 disappeared. The more investigators examined the simulator, the more the debate shifted from what was physically possible to what might have been psychologically intended. If Zahari had deliberately created a route resembling the eventual path of MH370, why would he have done it? Was he testing a hypothetical flight, experimenting with navigation, imagining a remote destination, or unknowingly creating a route that investigators would later interpret through the lens of the disaster? There was no definitive answer. Iannello's position was that the simulator evidence deserved far more attention than it had initially received because it potentially connected the pilot to the sequence of movements reconstructed from radar and satellite data. But even if the simulator had been relevant, it could not explain what happened to the aircraft afterward. It could not reveal whether anyone else was involved, whether the aircraft remained under human control throughout the journey, or where MH370 ultimately came to rest. Instead, it added another layer of uncertainty, because the same evidence could be interpreted in completely different ways depending on the assumptions made about the pilot and his intentions. And then the investigation moved into an entirely different realm: the possibility that nobody inside the aircraft had been responsible for its disappearance at all. One of the most controversial theories proposed that MH370 could have been remotely compromised through cyber technology. Historian Norman Davis suggested that a sophisticated hacker might have been capable of interfering with the aircraft and redirecting it toward a hidden destination. His theory centered on the possibility of technology designed to prevent another disaster on the scale of the September 11th attacks, including concepts involving remote control of aircraft systems. Davis referenced technology associated with Boeing and Honeywell and argued that, if such capabilities could theoretically exist, then the possibility of remote interference deserved consideration. From there, the theory became even more dramatic. Davis speculated that MH370 might have been carrying sensitive materials or personnel bound for Beijing, potentially making it a target for an organized operation. In his scenario, one remote actor could have attempted to seize control of the aircraft and redirect it toward Diego Garcia, the strategically important U.S. military installation in the Indian Ocean, only for another actor to intervene and take control of the aircraft again. Yet this cyber theory faced an enormous problem. There was no publicly established evidence demonstrating that MH370 had actually been remotely hijacked through such a system. The existence of technology capable of controlling or assisting an aircraft remotely does not automatically mean that the technology could secretly seize control of a Boeing 777 in flight, bypass the aircraft's security systems, and redirect it without leaving decisive forensic evidence. Nevertheless, the theory persisted because the known facts left so many gaps. The aircraft's communications had changed, its route had changed, and its final location remained unknown. Each unexplained detail created space for another hypothesis, and as the official search continued without a definitive wreckage site, increasingly unconventional ideas began competing for attention. The mystery had now expanded beyond the question of whether MH370 had been deliberately diverted. Researchers were asking who could have done it, how it could have been accomplished, and whether the aircraft might have been taken somewhere entirely different from the southern Indian Ocean. The deeper those questions went, the more the disappearance seemed to become a story not only about a missing aircraft, but about the limits of what investigators could reconstruct from incomplete evidence. But the cyber theory was only one branch of a much larger web of speculation. As the official search continued without producing the definitive wreckage investigators desperately needed, people began looking far beyond the southern Indian Ocean. Every unusual image, unexplained object, and fragment of information seemed capable of becoming the next possible clue. One of the strangest leads emerged in September 2019, when British video producer Ian Wilson became convinced that MH370 might not have ended up in the ocean at all. Instead, he believed the aircraft could have crashed somewhere deep inside a remote jungle, where dense vegetation and difficult terrain could conceal the wreckage from conventional searches and satellite imagery. Wilson began examining rainforests across Southeast Asia, searching for shapes that might resemble the missing Boeing 777. Eventually, he focused on an image from the Cambodian jungle, roughly 60 miles west of Phnom Penh, where something appeared to resemble an aircraft wedged against a mountainside at an unusual angle. To Wilson, the image was compelling enough to justify a physical expedition. Although debris associated with MH370 had already been discovered across the Indian Ocean, only some pieces had been conclusively linked to the missing aircraft, and that uncertainty gave alternative theories room to survive. Determined to investigate the image for themselves, Ian Wilson and his brother Jackie prepared to travel into the jungle. The journey, however, quickly demonstrated why such a location would have been extraordinarily difficult to search. The terrain was rugged, remote, and dangerous, and the guides accompanying the brothers eventually decided that continuing farther was too risky. Despite being forced to turn back, Ian and Jackie remained convinced that the object they had identified deserved further investigation. Aviation expert Lieutenant Tim McMillan also examined the image and acknowledged that the object appeared to have some characteristics of an airplane, but he pointed out a major problem. Its apparent size did not seem consistent with a Boeing 777, the aircraft type used for MH370. Eventually, experts determined that the object was not the missing Malaysian aircraft at all. Instead, the wreckage belonged to another airplane, bringing the jungle theory to a disappointing conclusion. Yet the episode demonstrated something that had become increasingly common throughout the MH370 investigation. Whenever one